This man's name is James Earl Ray. In the 60s, he was at the top of the FBI's most wanted list. Every law enforcement agency in America was searching for him. Even after he was captured, he managed to escape from prison twice, despite being placed in a maximum security facility with all eyes on him. So, how did he pull it off? What clever tricks did he use to escape? And what exactly did he do to become one of America's most wanted criminals? Our story today is about a man named James Earl Ray. From a young age, his life was tied to a world of theft and crime. James was the eldest of 9 siblings, and his father was a con artist and thief. The family constantly moved from city to city and state to state across America. Whenever they pulled off a scam or theft, they would flee to avoid getting caught by the police. This was during the 1930s and 1940s, almost 90 years ago. James grew up in this chaotic environment and found no path to follow in life other than his father's. He chose the same criminal path, becoming a thief and a con artist like his dad. He also started moving from state to state, committing petty thefts along the way. The first time James was arrested and convicted was in 1949 in California. It was the first time he went to prison, and since the theft was minor, he was sentenced to less than 1 year. However, less than 3 years later, in 1952, he was arrested again after attempting to rob a taxi driver in Illinois. This time, it was an armed robbery, so he received a 2-year prison sentence. During these 2 years, James tried to escape from prison several times, but all his attempts failed. He remained in prison until his sentence ended and was released. You might expect that he would turn over a new leaf after multiple incarcerations, but he didn't. Just a few months after his release, he was arrested for the 3rd time in 1955 in Missouri. He barely had time to breathe before being caught again. This time, he was charged with attempting to steal checks via mail, which in the United States is considered a federal crime. As a result, he received a 4-year prison sentence. Once again, James tried multiple times to escape, but failed and remained in prison until he completed his sentence and was released. And just a few months after being released, he was arrested for the 4th time in 1959. This time, it was for an armed robbery. And guess how much money he stole? $120. Adjusted for today's value, that would be about $1,000, a relatively small amount. Yet this time, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Why? Because of his extensive criminal record and repeated offenses. Every time he was released, he immediately committed another crime, often armed robbery, making him a significant danger to society. If something went wrong during one of his robberies, someone could get hurt, or worse. The judge sentenced him to 20 years, and James was sent to the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1959. This was the largest and most secure prison in the state, classified as maximum security. During his time there, James spent years obsessing over how to escape. Finally, after 8 years in prison, he came up with the perfect plan in 1967. At the time, James worked in the prison bakery. This bakery didn't just produce bread for the prison, but also large quantities that were sold outside. Every day, a truck would come to the prison to load and transport the bread. Over the years, James built strong relationships with his fellow inmates, especially those who worked with him in the bakery. He knew he would need their help when the time came to execute his escape plan. His idea was to hide in one of the bread delivery crates. After carefully studying the plan from every angle, it was time to act. He confided in his colleagues about his plan and asked for their help. Despite having nothing to gain, his friends agreed to assist him because of the bond he had built with them. On April 23, 1967, James hid himself inside one of the bread crates used for delivery. His colleagues helped cover him with bread to conceal him. But before doing this, they needed to distract the guards. One of the inmates pretended to injure his leg while working to draw the guards' attention. At that moment, James climbed into the crate. His colleagues placed bread over him to hide him from the guards. James stayed hidden inside the crate for several hours. He had made small air holes in the crate to breathe, because staying inside without air could suffocate him. However, the crate was cramped. The space was stifling and breathing wasn't easy. But he endured until, finally, the truck arrived and loaded the crate he was hiding in. Once the truck was on the road, James jumped out and quickly looked for a place to hide. He found a junkyard and stayed there until nightfall. The police and security forces launched search teams to look for him, but they couldn't find him anywhere. The search area was vast and difficult to secure, especially since his escape wasn't discovered immediately. After leaving the junkyard, James fled into the woods. The dense trees and isolated area made finding him almost impossible. Even aerial searches with helicopters failed to spot him because he was well hidden in the forest. James kept moving, traveling from one place to another and city to city to evade the police. First, he went to Chicago, and shortly afterward, he managed to leave the United States entirely, heading to Canada. There, he stayed in Toronto for a while, then moved to Montreal. After spending several months in Canada, James decided to return to the United States, believing the search for him had died down. This time, he headed south to Alabama. Not long after, he moved even further south, leaving the U.S. again and heading to Mexico. In Mexico, James tried some bizarre ventures, including attempting to become a director of adult films. He lived there for a while, but by March of 1968, he returned to the U.S. and settled in Georgia. In less than a year after his prison escape, James had managed to traverse the entire North American continent. At this point, James was a wanted man, but not at the highest level. Law enforcement wasn't yet expending all its resources to find him. Technology back then wasn't as advanced. There were no surveillance cameras or sophisticated electronic tracking systems like we have today, which made tracking people much harder. Around this time, James purchased a Remington rifle with a scope that had a magnification of 7 times. He told the gun shop owner he planned to use it for hunting. After buying the rifle, James traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, and rented a small room in a house across the street from another small hotel called the Lorraine Motel. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, James entered the bathroom of his room, opened the window, and aimed his rifle toward a man standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He fired a single shot, killing the man instantly. That man was Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most significant figures in modern American history. Martin Luther King was the foremost advocate for African American civil rights and one of the most prominent social activists in the civil rights movement. Following the assassination, the police and FBI launched an immediate investigation. The FBI announced James Earl Ray as their prime suspect. During the investigation, they found a map in James's room with circles drawn around Martin Luther King Jr.'s residence and the church he attended. They also found the Remington rifle used in the shooting, along with a secondary scope nearby. All the items carried James Earl Ray's fingerprints. The motive for the assassination was unclear, but the FBI listed James as one of the most wanted criminals in the United States, placing him at the very top of their list. A massive manhunt ensued. Having spent a lifetime evading police, James was no stranger to being hunted. However, this time was different. Every law enforcement agency in the country was looking for him. Knowing he needed to leave the U.S. as quickly as possible, James headed north to Canada again. There, he managed to forge a Canadian passport and used it to board a flight to London. From London, he traveled to Portugal, where he attempted to secure work as a mercenary in Africa, but his efforts were unsuccessful. Eventually, James returned to London and arrived at Heathrow Airport, intending to travel to an African country using his fake Canadian passport. However, airport security grew suspicious and detained him. Upon investigation, they uncovered his true identity as one of America's most wanted fugitives. James Earl Ray was arrested at Heathrow on June 8, 1968, 2 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. James was extradited to the United States, where he faced trial. During the trial, James initially confessed to the murder but later recanted, claiming he only confessed out of fear of the death penalty. He stated his lawyer had advised him that pleading not guilty and going to trial could result in a jury sentencing him to death. However, James later claimed his lawyer had been mistaken and that Tennessee had already abolished the death penalty. He argued that he confessed purely to avoid execution. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence against him, his room, rifle, and fingerprints, James changed his story. He alleged that a mysterious organization was behind the assassination and had used him as a scapegoat. He claimed he had unknowingly worked with this organization and mentioned a man named Raoul who had directed him to buy the rifle and had been in the room with him at the time of the shooting. While Martin Luther King Jr. had many enemies due to his civil rights advocacy, no concrete evidence supported James's claims of an organization or the existence of Raoul. The court ultimately convicted James Earl Ray, sentencing him to 99 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. He was sent to Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, a maximum security prison, and one of Tennessee's most secure facilities. The prison, resembling a fortress, housed some of the most dangerous criminals imaginable: rapists, murderers, and serial killers. It was a harsh environment where even the slightest wrong move could lead to fatal consequences. The prison was surrounded by a 5-meter-high wall nearly a meter thick, built from incredibly dense stones, some weighing over a ton. Escape was nearly impossible. The wall was topped with barbed wire, carrying a powerful electric current capable of instantly incapacitating anyone who touched it. The electric current running through the barbed wires wouldn't kill anyone instantly, but it was strong enough to knock someone down and possibly render them unconscious. And even if by some miracle a prisoner managed to overcome all these obstacles, the prison was surrounded by 9 watchtowers. Guards stationed in these towers were heavily armed, equipped with shotguns, handguns, and rifles, and they had full authority to shoot any prisoner attempting to escape or scale the walls. When James saw all these barriers, he realized his best chance to escape was underground. He spent a long time studying his cell, looking for weaknesses. The biggest one was the ventilation opening, which had a metal cover secured with screws embedded in concrete. Removing the screws wasn't too difficult, but the opening itself was too small, barely big enough for a child or a cat, let alone an adult man. Determined, James began using a spoon to chip away at the concrete around the vent, slowly widening the opening. This was a painstaking process. Imagine digging through concrete with a spoon. It was bound to take months. Every night, James would carefully scrape away at the edges of the vent and cover his work using a clever mixture he made from toothpaste and dirt he collected from the prison yard. He'd blend them to create a cement-like substance to mask the exposed edges, making it look as if the vent was untouched. After each session, he'd put the metal cover back in place to avoid detection. During this time, James also deliberately lost weight, knowing that the slimmer he became, the easier it would be to fit through the vent. After months of grueling effort, James finally managed to expand the vent to a size he could squeeze through. Behind the vent was a network of pipes running beneath the prison. These pipes carried everything from sewage to electricity, heating, and steam, essential for the prison's operations. At the end of this tunnel of pipes was a large ventilation fan. The fan's purpose was to expel air from the prison cells to the outside. James had studied the layout carefully and knew that if he could get past the fan, he would emerge outside the main prison building, into the yard. Why the yard? During the daytime, inmates were allowed access to the yard under heavy surveillance. James had noticed a ground-level manhole cover that resembled a sewer entrance. Based on his observations, he believed that the pipes beneath this cover likely led to the power station just outside the prison walls. The power station supplied electricity and steam to the prison, and James theorized that if he could get into those pipes, they would lead him out of the prison altogether. Of course, accessing this manhole during the day was impossible because it was under constant watch. His only option was to pass through the ventilation tunnels beneath the cells, reach the yard undetected, and then get into the manhole to follow the pipes to the power station. However, there was a major problem. The large ventilation fan had iron bars blocking access, and there was no way to get through them without cutting them. James didn't have a saw or any tool that could do the job, so he spent months pondering how to obtain one. Eventually, he realized he'd need help from someone on the outside. That someone was his brother Jerry. As mentioned earlier, James was the oldest of 9 siblings, and Jerry was the sibling closest to him, frequently visiting him in prison. James wrote a cryptic letter to Jerry asking for his assistance. To avoid suspicion, the letter didn't explicitly say, "Bring me a saw." Instead, the two had previously agreed on a secret code during one of Jerry's visits, ensuring that even if the guards read the letter, they wouldn't understand its true meaning. Jerry executed the plan with precision. He bought a small saw blade and hid it inside the sole of his shoe. He removed the bottom layer of the sole, placed the blade inside, and then glued the sole back on. With the blade securely hidden, Jerry went to visit James at the prison. Family visits were allowed but took place in a monitored room. Before entering, visitors were thoroughly searched to ensure they weren't smuggling anything in for the inmates. But because Jerry had hidden the saw blade so cleverly in his shoe, it was impossible for the guards to detect it. He sat in the visiting room while his brother James entered wearing identical shoes, same type, same color, and same size. Family members were allowed to bring inmates' shoes and clothing from outside, excluding prison uniforms, but including items like undergarments and hygiene supplies. In fact, Jerry had been the one to bring James his shoes during a previous visit, so matching them was simple. During the visit, the brothers chatted under the watchful eye of the guard. They acted completely normal, so as not to arouse suspicion. Quietly, they swapped their shoes. The guard noticed nothing, and James successfully smuggled the small saw blade back to his cell. That very night, he descended into the pipe passageway and began cutting through the fan's iron bars. James knew this task would be slow and arduous, requiring months of persistence. Every night, he carefully worked on the bars, and after 4 months of relentless effort, he finally managed to cut through them. However, the next challenge took him by surprise: the fan blades themselves. The fan was made of incredibly strong metal. James had assumed he could bend or twist the blades by hand to create an opening, but they were far sturdier than he had anticipated. No matter how hard he pushed, pulled, or struck the blades, they refused to budge. Realizing he needed another tool to bend the fan blades, he decided he'd require a pipe wrench, a tool large and strong enough to do the job. Getting a tool of this size from outside the prison was impossible, but James had a stroke of luck. One of his closest friends in prison, Jake Morlock, worked as a plumber. Jake's job involved repairing pipes and systems throughout the prison, giving him access to tools, including a pipe wrench. Though these tools were monitored, Jake could discreetly borrow one for a night. When James confided in Jake about his escape plan, he invited him to join. Jake agreed and committed to providing the wrench they needed to bend the fan blades. However, another issue arose. How would Jake get into James's cell on the night of the escape? They weren't cellmates, and each prisoner was assigned to a specific cell based on a roster kept in a nearby office. The roster was written in pencil, allowing guards to easily erase and rewrite names when transferring prisoners to different cells. James noticed this and realized he could exploit the system. The office containing the roster wasn't locked, as it wasn't considered important, and inmates could access it during their free time. Guards patrolling the floor didn't expect anyone to tamper with it. James carefully observed the guards' routines and picked the perfect day for his plan: the 2nd of May, 1991. On this day, the regular guards were on leave, replaced by less experienced substitutes who were unfamiliar with the prisoners. There were also fewer of them, making it the ideal opportunity. During recreation time, James snuck into the office and erased his cellmate's name, replacing it with Jake's. That evening, as prisoners were being called back to their cells, the substitute guards relied on the altered roster to guide them. The plan worked flawlessly. Jake was sent to James's cell under the guards' watchful eyes. Once inside, the two friends waited patiently until 2:00 a.m., the time of the last guard check before the morning head count at 6:00 a.m. As soon as the guards completed their rounds, James and Jake executed the next step of their plan. They placed dummy heads they had crafted onto their pillows to create the illusion they were sleeping. If a guard happened to pass by, they would see what looked like two men asleep in their beds. The pair then squeezed through the vent opening. Despite Jake's larger size, he managed to fit through with great difficulty, though he was visibly struggling. Together, they reached the fan and used the pipe wrench to bend the blades, finally creating a narrow opening. However, the opening was too small for Jake to pass through due to his size. James barely squeezed through, but for Jake, it was impossible. After trying several solutions, they realized there was no way Jake could proceed. Reluctantly, Jake returned to the cell while James continued alone. James emerged in the prison yard as planned. Heading straight for the ground-level manhole he believed would lead to the power station outside the prison walls. Moving cautiously to avoid being spotted by the guards in the watchtowers, he reached the manhole and lifted the cover. But as he did, he was hit by a blast of scalding steam. The pipes below were used to transport steam for heating the prison, and the heat was unbearable. James quickly realized entering the manhole would be like stepping into an inferno. The outdated pipes had poor insulation, allowing extreme heat to escape. His skin began to burn almost immediately. Desperate, he climbed back up, sealing the manhole behind him. Unfortunately, the escaping steam had caught the attention of the watchtower guards. As James poked his head out, they spotted him. The guards sounded the alarm, and James was swiftly apprehended. He was taken to a secure room for questioning. The investigation uncovered his entire escape plan, including Jake's involvement and the tampered vent in James's cell. Even Jerry's role came to light. He had been waiting outside the prison in a car at a prearranged location to help James escape further. Jerry had even brought a gun and some cash for James, ready to assist him once he escaped. Jerry waited in his car near the agreed-upon spot outside the prison until dawn. When James didn't show up, Jerry realized that the escape attempt had likely failed. He decided to head back home. Later, he heard on the radio about the failed escape of James Earl Ray, his brother, who had been apprehended during his attempt to flee the prison. James's meticulously planned escape, which he had worked on for nearly 2 years, was completely foiled. The failure was a devastating blow to him. As punishment, James was placed in solitary confinement for 2 months. Solitary confinement meant complete isolation in a small cell, with no interaction or contact with other inmates. When James was finally released from solitary, his thoughts immediately returned to escaping. For someone serving a life sentence, escape was the only logical option. However, by now, the situation was even more challenging. Every guard in the prison was keeping a close watch on him. Despite the heightened scrutiny, James spent years looking for another opportunity, analyzing every possible weakness or loophole in the prison's security. 2 years passed, then 3. By 1976, 5 years after his first escape attempt, James was working in the prison laundry. During some routine maintenance work in the laundry area, he noticed that the workers had replaced a few old metal pipes. The workers left the discarded pipes lying on the ground, and no one seemed to care about removing them. Quietly, James took the pipes, each about 1 meter long, and hid them behind the piles of laundry in the corner of the room. At the time, he wasn't entirely sure how he might use them, but he had a gut feeling they could come in handy for a future plan. He decided to keep them hidden and wait for the right moment. Time continued to pass, and by 1977, 6 years had elapsed since James's last escape attempt. Each day, he searched for new opportunities, scanning the prison for any vulnerabilities that might aid in his escape. One day, while walking in the prison yard, James noticed something that piqued his interest. As mentioned earlier, the prison walls were topped with electrified barbed wire. However, James observed a small gap in one part of the wall where it met the adjacent mountainside. In this particular spot, the barbed wire was slightly elevated above the wall, leaving a narrow opening. It was just wide enough for someone to squeeze through without touching the live wire and getting electrocuted. James carefully studied the area. The spot was situated where the prison wall and the mountainside intersected, creating a natural advantage. On the other side of the wall, the ground was higher, sloping upward with the mountain. If James managed to climb the wall, he could easily jump down to the other side without injuring himself because of the elevated terrain. The only remaining question was how to scale the wall. That's when James connected the dots. The metal pipes he had hidden in the laundry could be fashioned into a makeshift ladder. The idea was clear and logical in his mind. He would build a ladder using the pipes, climb the wall, and escape through the gap in the electrified wire. The plan was bold, dangerous, and fraught with risks, but James believed it was his best shot. Over the coming weeks, he began devising the specifics of his escape, knowing that every detail had to be perfect. The first problem James faced was that the pipes he had weren't enough to build a ladder tall enough to scale the wall, which stood at 5 meters, a considerable height. He needed to find more pipes somehow. That's when James approached one of his fellow inmates, a man named Jack Shelton. Jack was a seasoned escape artist with a history of attempts from several prisons. When James explained his plan, Jack immediately welcomed the idea. He found it clear, simple, and feasible. James specifically turned to Jack because he worked in the prison workshop. This workshop handled plumbing and metalwork, and it often dealt with pipes similar to the ones James had hidden in the laundry room. Bit by bit, Jack began smuggling pipes from the workshop. Pipes were considered materials, not tools, and thus weren't strictly monitored. Unlike tools, like hammers, screwdrivers, or pliers, which were inventoried daily by the guards, materials like pipes weren't counted or tracked with the same level of scrutiny. After James's first escape attempt, during which Jake Morlock had used a stolen pipe wrench, the guards had tightened security on tools. But pipes didn't fall into this category, making them easier to smuggle. Jack managed to sneak out a pipe almost every day, sometimes hiding it in his clothes, other times tossing it out of a window. Over time, they gathered enough pipes to complete the ladder. James also brought a new member into their team, his current cellmate, Earl Hill. Now the team consisted of 3 members, James, Jack, and Earl. Some might wonder why James didn't involve Jake Morlock, his partner from the first escape attempt. The answer was simple. After their failed attempt, the guards had separated them, placing them in different wings of the prison. They rarely saw each other anymore. However, James and his team began planning the next phase of their escape. They couldn't assemble the ladder and run across the yard, carrying it in broad daylight without being noticed by the guards. Instead, they decided to hide the pipes near the section of the wall they planned to climb. This was the spot where the prison wall met the mountainside, and there was a small gap beneath the electrified wire wide enough for someone to squeeze through. Near this spot was a small drainage trench designed to channel rainwater away from the yard. James and his team hid the pipes in this trench, camouflaging them with leaves and other debris. The trench's recessed position made it nearly impossible for the guards to spot the pipes unless they stood directly above the area and looked down. It was the perfect hiding place until the moment of the escape. During this time, the team also studied the guards' routines. The prison had relatively few guards compared to the number of inmates, with a ratio of 1 guard for every 50 prisoners. While the guards were heavily armed and the prison was equipped with watchtowers and electrified wires, this staffing shortage was a significant weakness. It gave James and his team the opportunity to monitor the guards' movements without drawing attention. The most critical watchtower for their plan was Tower 4, which was closest to the escape point. The guard assigned to this tower during recreation time was Floyd Hawks. James and his team observed him for months and noticed something that worked in their favor. Every day, Floyd brought a newspaper to his post and spent his entire shift reading it, rarely lifting his head to watch the yard. James realized this habit was a vulnerability they could exploit. It was also during this time that James reached out to his brother Jerry for help once again. Jerry, always ready to assist, provided two key resources. The first thing James asked Jerry for was money, a significant amount. Inmates could use money inside the prison for various purposes. There was a small store where they could buy items like books, toiletries, and even small luxuries like televisions. Inmates also paid each other for services, such as laundry. James intended to use the money to bribe other inmates to help distract the guards during the escape. Since it wasn't allowed for a prisoner to suddenly receive a large sum of money, Jerry smuggled it in small amounts over several months, and James carefully saved it. The second thing James asked for was an escape bag. He wrote a coded letter to Jerry requesting a bag filled with items he would need after escaping. Jerry prepared the bag with hair dye, a raincoat for warmth, canned food, medical supplies, and a loaded handgun. He buried the bag in a cemetery near the prison, the location agreed upon by the team. The escape was set for Friday, June 10, 1977. That afternoon, during recreation time, James and his team began executing their plan. The pipes they had hidden were waiting in the trench near the wall. The first step was to distract the guards. This was where the money James had saved came into play. He had bribed several inmates to stage a fake fight in the yard to create a massive distraction. At James's signal, chaos erupted as the inmates began shouting and throwing punches. The guards in the yard, only 3 or 4 in number, were overwhelmed and focused entirely on breaking up the brawl. Meanwhile, James looked up at Tower 4 to check on Floyd Hawks. As expected, Floyd was engrossed in his newspaper, completely oblivious to the commotion. Seizing the moment, James and his team rushed to the trench, pulled out the pipes, and began assembling the ladder. They had practiced the assembly process thoroughly, so it took them less than a minute. The ladder was fitted with a hook-like attachment at the top to latch securely onto the wall. Once it was ready, James tested it briefly to ensure it was stable. Everything was set. The moment they had spent months preparing for had finally arrived. James grabbed the metal ladder and tried to place it against the wall, carefully attempting to secure the hook at the top. As he adjusted the ladder, raising and lowering it to position it correctly, he accidentally lifted it too high, and it touched the electrified wire above. Instantly, the electric current surged from the wire through the ladder, shocking James and throwing him violently to the ground, launching him nearly 3 meters back. The jolt was so powerful that for a moment, his companions feared he was dead. But James managed to recover, taking a few moments to gather himself and shake off the shock. His friend Earl, realizing they couldn't afford any more mistakes, carefully took the ladder and, with precise movements, positioned it against the wall. This time, he successfully secured the hook at the top, ensuring the ladder was stable and ready to climb. James, still shaken but determined, was the first to ascend the ladder to prove he was capable of continuing. Once he reached the top, his companions followed him without hesitation. On the other side, as mentioned earlier, the ground was elevated, so they didn't have to jump 5 meters down, risking injury. Instead, the descent was relatively easy, allowing the 3 of them to escape quickly. However, their escape did not go unnoticed. A few inmates in the yard spotted the ladder and seized the opportunity. In moments, 3 additional prisoners scrambled up the ladder and joined the escape. The last of these was David Powell, a prison cook who was still wearing his white chef's uniform. The bright white clothing immediately caught the attention of a guard in Tower 3, the furthest watchtower. Unlike Floyd Hawks in Tower 4, this guard was alert and quickly noticed the commotion. As David climbed over the wall, the guard aimed his rifle and fired at the ladder, striking another inmate who was attempting to climb. The inmate, Jerry Woods, wasn't fatally injured, but he fell to the ground, pulling the ladder down with him. The remaining inmates who had hoped to escape retreated, while chaos erupted in the yard with prisoners shouting and chanting, "Over the wall! Over the wall!" The gunfire finally startled Floyd Hawks, who awoke in a panic and fumbled for his rifle, accidentally falling to the ground in the process. By this point, the 6 escapees, James, Earl, Jack, David, and 2 others, had already made their way into the forest beyond the wall. The prison alarm blared as news of the escape spread. Reports quickly reached the state governor's office and law enforcement agencies. The problem, however, was the prison's remote location in a small town of only about 500 residents, far from major police or state security facilities. The response was delayed, giving the escapees valuable time to get further away. Despite the slow initial response, the eventual reaction was massive. Local police, state troopers, border patrol, and hundreds of officers from various agencies, including the FBI, descended on the area. The escape became a national story, with media outlets from across the country rushing to cover it. For the FBI, James Earl Ray's escape was particularly alarming. He was one of their most wanted criminals. The question on everyone's mind was, how could someone like James escape? The search effort was monumental, involving ground teams, helicopters, and bloodhounds scouring the dense forest behind the prison. The forest itself presented its own challenges. It was vast and treacherous, making it difficult for both the escapees to navigate and the search teams to pursue them. But the authorities banked on the harsh terrain slowing the fugitives down. As soon as they cleared the prison wall, James and his companions headed for the forest. They quickly decided to split up, knowing it would be harder for the authorities to track them individually. James's goal was to reach Route 116, which would lead him to the cemetery where Jerry had buried the escape bag. However, as night fell, visibility became a major challenge. In the chaos of the escape, James had lost track of his direction. Adrenaline had pushed him to run blindly, and now, deep in the forest, he realized he had no idea where he was. The dense trees and thick undergrowth made it nearly impossible to orient himself. After hours of wandering, James finally gave up hope of finding the road or the cemetery. Some might wonder why Jerry didn't wait outside the prison like he did during the first escape attempt. The answer is simple. The first escape happened at night, giving them a long head start before the guards noticed. This escape, however, took place in broad daylight under the guards' watchful eyes. Any attempt by Jerry to assist directly would have implicated him immediately. Now alone in the forest, James pressed forward, determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and the prison. For 48 hours, law enforcement teams scoured the area. 4 of the 6 escapees were captured within this time, but James was not one of them. He continued trudging through the forest, exhausted, hungry, and disoriented. Finally, at 10:30 p.m., 11 hours after the escape, a search team's bloodhounds picked up James's scent. The dogs led their handlers through the dense forest, barking frantically as they closed in. At 2:00 a.m., the dogs stopped at a pile of leaves and began circling and barking at it. The officers surrounded the area with their weapons drawn. One of them prodded the pile with his rifle, and suddenly, James emerged, his hands raised in surrender. He had crafted the pile of leaves to conceal himself, hoping to remain undetected, but the dogs had given him away. Without resisting, James was arrested and returned to Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. The 6th and final escapee was captured shortly after James, officially ending the escape attempt. James later discovered that he had run in the wrong direction during the escape. If he had gone the opposite way, he would have reached the main road, the cemetery, and the escape bag that Jerry had buried. With that bag, He could have stolen a car or hitched a ride, escaping the area before the search intensified. Instead, he had only managed to get about 10 kilometers from the prison before being captured. The failed escape was a national sensation, covered extensively in newspapers and on television. As punishment, James's sentence was extended by 1 year, increasing it from 99 to 100 years, a symbolic addition that made little practical difference. Despite this failure, James attempted several more escapes in the years that followed. However, by then, the prison guards and administration knew his tendencies and kept him under constant surveillance, making future attempts nearly impossible. James continued to insist on his innocence in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. for the rest of his life, frequently claiming he had been framed and used as a scapegoat. Interestingly, even some members of King's family believed James was not the killer, pointing fingers instead at government agencies like the CIA and alleging a larger conspiracy. To this day, debates and conspiracy theories persist about James's involvement. Was he truly the assassin, or was he a pawn in a much larger scheme? Perhaps the most plausible theory is that James played a role in the assassination, but was manipulated and used to shield the true perpetrators from exposure. In the end, though, all of this remains speculation. James Earl Ray died in prison in 1998, maintaining his innocence until his last breath. And with that, we've reached the end of our story. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Check out these other amazing stories, and thank you for watching. See you in the next video.